I know you are trying to live a good life. We each are trying to do the best we can. We're trying to live a flourishing, wholesome life, a good life. Do you know the ancient Greek philosophers wrote thick tomes about what makes for a good human life, a flourishing life? Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, they wrote thousands of pages of what it would be to lead a good life. Well, you could read all their books, and it mostly comes down to the most basic things. You know what a good life is, the right measure of work and love and joy. But there was one essential component they would talk about again and again. That what makes for a good life? Friends. It was utterly essential. To lead a good, meaningful life is to have friends. And our scripture talks about this all the time. You might not just notice it. The word love in Greek is philia, or there's a number of words, but one is philia or phileo, and that means friendship. But then we translate it into the English word love, and it sounds something either more romantic or more grand or more abstract. Jesus said, "I now call you my friends." That's the type of love he was talking about. We need friends for a good life. I'm worried these days that surveys show we all have less friends. Now, you don't need a lot of friends, but we each need a couple folks we can talk to. I know many people don't even have a couple folks. You know, one key aspect of church, I think, is just trying to increase the friend circle. I think church in its essence is about friendship. Washington Gladden, one of the great congregational theologians of the early 20th century, he said that as a theologian, all religion comes down to friendship. The spirit of friendship with your brothers and sisters, with God, friendship with yourself. He said it's all about friendship. So when you hear the word love and you hear ministers like me talk about love all the time, the most central form of love in a human life is friendship. Nothing more grand, nothing more abstract. So I pray you have a couple friends. Well, that is one of the reasons I love church. And I wanted to start with friendship because I want to talk about a harder concept today around church, but I want it to be a friendly spirit. Everything I say today, I mean it in a friendly way. But I want to talk about this struggle over the past decades to achieve openness and inclusiveness around the LGBTQIA community and to be in a spirit of friendship with all people, no matter how different they are. At times, it's been an unfriendly thing. But I want to describe some of what's happened at this church and in my past. So this week, actually, just in a couple days, I'm going down to the Cathedral of Hope in Dallas, Texas. It's the largest LGBTQIA plus church in the world. It's over 3,000 members, mostly folks of that community. And they have a full, beautiful church ministry, but they've also always focused on inclusion for that community. And in fact, during the AIDS crisis, do you remember the epidemic, what it was like? During that time in the 90s, for that church, they had to bury their entire choir, their entire trustee board. They had to, I think they were performing 500 funerals a year there. It was horrible. But this church has a beautiful ministry and they're leading the way, so I'm visiting as minister at First-Plymouth. I'm visiting to go there and learn from them how to be truly inclusive. What new iterations could First-Plymouth do in being open to the LGBTQIA community to be really inclusive? I will be taking part in their worship services. We'll live stream from there back to here. And then the next week, their pastor, the Reverend Dr. Neil Thomas, will come here and preach all the services at First-Plymouth and walk with us in the Lincoln Pride Parade. He's been a leader, an advocate, an activist for gay liberation, and he's going to help teach us what might be the new iterations. I should remind you of the past, because we've done such good work at First-Plymouth. but now we're trying to see if there's even more to do. But let me remind you, in 1981, we invited the San Francisco Gay Men's Chorus to sing at First-Plymouth. On their national tour, we were the only church in the nation. 1981, dial back the cultural clock. I mean, we had protesters, we had the community in confusion about, is this right for a church to have the Gay Men's Chorus? I mean, it was 1981. But with the inclusive courage of our congregation at that time, we did that. And then in the years just following that, by the mid-1980s, we began to perform same-sex marriages at First-Plymouth. Now, they couldn't get a license. Remember, it wasn't until 2015 that the Supreme Court okayed that. But we were performing marriages here, and that too caused consternation and confusion, but with the inclusive courage, they just kept taking steps forward. And then forming the Plymouth Pride group so that there could be an advocacy support group right within the church. And then more and more gay folks joining the church in those years. Now, there was, even when I came in 2005, there was still this fear that if you become a gay church, oh, hear how strange that phrase is, but if you become a gay church, that will cause problems and you'll lose membership. But something amazing happened. We just kept growing. People would leave the church saying, I don't want to be around a church this inclusive, but then if one left, two would come. We went from being a 1,500 member church to a 4,000 member church, all during those efforts. It reminds me of a spiritual story. There's different versions to this, but it's always in some little monastery deep in the woods that has been shrinking through the years, and it comes to be that there are only 3 monks. And then their leader of the monastery is dying as a very old man, and he says to the other 2 monks that are left, just as he's about to die, he says, the next visitor that comes to this monastery will be the Christ. And then he dies. Now there's only 2. And those 2 monks wonder, well, could it be? Could the next visitor be the Christ? And then one day a visitor came by the monastery, and they treated that person like he might be the Christ with such a graciousness and an honor that that person decided to join the monastery. And then in the days ahead, other visitors would come, and not knowing if they might be the Christ, they treated them with such dignity and love. Those people would start to join the monastery. By treating everyone like they might be Christ, that monastery grew and grew. I think that's kind of what happened at First-Plymouth. Regardless of your sexual orientation or your background or your perspectives, we were trying to treat you like you were the Christ walking in our midst. And all through the 80s and 90s and the early 2000s, and now we just grew and grew. It's a pretty cool story. You know, it's causing me to reflect on my own story and ministry around this. I was ordained in 1990, so I go way back now. And that was fairly early in the struggle for churches to be inclusive. And I've taken 3 churches through what's called the open and affirming process, where you discuss all the issues and you study and you learn, and then finally you take a vote whether to be open and affirming to people of different sexual orientations. And back in the 90s, you know, that would mean you'd sit in circles and kind of openly let people share that they thought being gay was a sin or that it was horrible. So it was almost like forming circles that allow hate speech. Nowadays it feels that way. But back then you went through this open kind of sharing that almost feels abusive, but that was back then. But I've gone through 3 churches now, taking them through the open and affirming. And looking back on it, I think I've learned a couple things. So let me end by sharing with you, hopefully in a friendly spirit, what I think I've learned. And let me start with a frustration. I am so tired about how the Bible has been used in this conversation. So tired and frustrated, I can barely stand it. So back early in the struggle, in the 90s, I had so much energy about showing that the Bible is not some clear witness about being gay as a sin. There's not some clear theological declaration in the Bible. I would take people through these careful studies showing there's only 7 texts, 7 obscure texts that are hurled at gay people as sort of Bible bullets and beating them over the head, but it's only 7 little weird texts, and it's not even clear what they mean. The 7 texts used are Ham and Noah in Genesis 9, and then Sodom and Gomorrah in Genesis 19, and then Leviticus, the holiness codes in 18 and 19, or 18 and 20, and then in 1 Corinthians chapter 6 and 1 Timothy and 1 Romans. That's all there is. Those are just 7 obscure texts. And I would have to teach that the word homosexuality is in none of those texts. That's an English word that was coined in the 1890s. But sometimes we'll put that new English word in those texts, but it's not referring to same-gender love between 2 loving adults, mature, committed relationships. Those texts are actually talking about cultic prostitution in the ancient world, or the 2 Genesis texts are rape scenes. Of course, rape is horrible. And then in Paul, in Corinthians and Romans, it looks like he's talking about a form of pederasty, a form of sexual training in the Greek world. It doesn't look like they're talking about what we call being gay at all. So I would have to argue in intricate ways that the Bible, it's not saying in any way that being gay is wrong, and that it's very ambiguous what they're even talking about. But regardless of teaching what the Bible means, year after year, people just pull out a text and use it against people. Year after year, even today, you'll hear people say the Bible thinks being gay is wrong or sinful. Where do they get that? Just because people repeat it. I'm so tired of it. And on the face of it now, I don't want to argue anymore what the Bible's perspective on that is, because even if we discovered some manuscript that said being gay is a sin, well, the cultural assumptions in the ancient world, it doesn't surprise me at all if we could find literature that says that. But we've already learned you don't take the cultural assumptions from the ancient world and impose them on our own. We learned that with slavery. The Bible supports slavery. That's the cultural assumption of its time. But no one believes slavery's ethical anymore. Or those passages about women not preaching. We've learned, or what about marriage? You wouldn't want to follow a so-called biblical notion of marriage. And nobody does. I mean, would Solomon have 600 wives? Or how many wives did David have and concubines? I mean, biblical marriage is not something anyone wants to copy. But there's massive amount of texts about that. But then some people will pick 7 weird texts not even talking about being gay and use it that way. That's just ridiculous. It's ridiculous, and I'm tired of it. I'm sharing my frustration. I'm really tired of it. Jesus has taught us to be alongside the most marginalized, to increase the spirit of friendship and love. If you want to follow the Bible, focus on what the Bible is really about. I also have learned something from all these years of pastoring through this transformation and trying to move towards inclusiveness. I've also learned that I don't trust progress as much as I used to. Now, on the face of it, it looks like we've made incredible progress. That you wouldn't believe how the sensibility of the normal American has changed. In 2014, before the Supreme Court ruling on marriage, 61% of America was against same-sex marriage. 61%. But just a couple years after that ruling now, it's over 60% that are in support of it. It exactly flip-flopped to the majority being in support of it. And it looks like we've made lots of progress, and I think we have, but I worry. At any moment, we could fall back into exclusion and hate. And I worry about the complexities of the conversation, say with our transgender brother, with our transgender community, and how we're trying to understand everything politically these days, and the confusion and the fear that can arise. I worry we could take steps back. Let's don't take any steps back. Let's keep moving towards that great spirit of friendship with everyone. I also have learned to be very fearful of the slippery slope argument, because I've heard it for 35 years now around this work. The slippery slope argument it's a rhetorical move, a deceptive move that seizes upon our concern about unintended consequences. So the slippery slope argument is like, well, if you allow the speed limit to be 50 miles an hour, then everyone will go 100 miles an hour. That if you set one mark, it'll slide a lot further than wherever you set it. And so with the slippery slope argument, I hear people say the weirdest things, like back then, like if you allow gay marriage, well then someone will want to marry their dog or marry their kitten. Or like it's a slippery slope. You let people of the same gender marry, then it'll just be crazy. That slippery slope argument is acting like we can't make any basic discernments and that it's all going to go to hell in a handbasket. It's a fear-based, false kind of argument, and I hear it all the time. I'm trying to share just some of my frustrations, but I want to end with honoring the great joy and the beauty that's happened year by year in our churches as we move towards inclusiveness. There are some 300 churches in Lincoln. Sadly, over 200 of those still don't think it's right to be gay or that women can preach. The vast majority still hold to that. But on the other hand, there's many, many churches now in Lincoln that don't. And step by step, we're moving forward. I think, I pray, I hope. So, this has all been spoken in the spirit of friendship. In that spirit, amen.